Welcome to the Noble Wisdom Path, where we uncover the sacred truths of your journey through Buddhist wisdom. In the ancient teachings of Buddhism, there exists a profound paradox that many seekers overlook. The very boundaries we fear might separate us from others are actually the sacred spaces that allow for our deepest connections. Like the banks of a river that don't constrain the water but give it direction and purpose, our personal boundaries don't limit our compassion. They channel it with wisdom. This is what the Buddha called compassion guided by wisdom, not merely kindness without discernment. In Zen monasteries, monks maintain strict boundaries around their meditation practice. They don't do this from coldness, but from the profound understanding that true presence requires protected space. As the Zen master Dogen wrote, "To study the self is to forget the self." But how can we study what we've given away entirely to others? The Buddhist concept of boundaries differs greatly from Western individualism. It's not about building walls to protect the ego, but about creating sacred containers that honor both ourselves and others. When we lack boundaries, we don't just harm ourselves. We offer others a diminished version of who we truly are. Many of us have been taught that being boundaryless is spiritual, that constant availability and endless giving are the marks of a compassionate heart. But the Buddha himself set clear boundaries. He established times for teaching and times for silence. He knew when to engage and when to withdraw. As the Dhammapada reminds us, though 1,000 times 1,000 in battle one may conquer, yet should one conquer just oneself, one is the greatest conqueror. This conquest of self begins with the sacred art of boundaries. Today, we'll explore how Buddhist wisdom offers a revolutionary approach to boundaries. One that doesn't separate us from others, but actually creates the conditions for authentic connection. Through ancient teachings and modern neuroscience, through stories of struggle and transformation, we'll discover that boundaries aren't walls, but doorways to our most authentic selves. In the heart of Seattle, amid the bustle of a popular yoga studio, there was a teacher named Michael. Students flocked to his classes not just for his technical skill, but for his extraordinary availability. He answered every text message within minutes. He stayed late after every class. He covered for colleagues without hesitation. His smile never faltered. His energy seemed limitless, and his door was always open. Michael is like a walking embodiment of compassion, his students would say. He's what a spiritual teacher should be, always there, always giving. But beneath this perfect exterior, something was eroding. Each night, Michael would return to his apartment exhausted, not just physically, but in a deeper, more troubling way. The joy he once felt in teaching had become a distant memory. His meditation practice, once the cornerstone of his life, had dwindled to mechanical motions before bed. His journal entries grew shorter, then stopped altogether. One evening, after a particularly demanding day where he had taught 3 additional classes for a sick colleague, counseled 2 students through personal crises, and reorganized the entire studio schedule, Michael found himself sitting by the shores of Lake Washington. As the sunset painted the water in shades of amber and gold, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. What startled him wasn't the dark circles under his eyes or the tension in his shoulders. It was the vacancy in his gaze. The light that had once animated his face had dimmed to a flicker. In that moment of recognition, a question arose from somewhere deep within. In becoming everything to everyone, have I disappeared? This question, this moment of seeing, marks the beginning of our exploration. For Michael's journey reflects a struggle many of us face on the spiritual path, the tension between boundless compassion and necessary boundaries, between caring for others and honoring ourselves. Through Michael's story, and through the wisdom of Buddhist teachings both ancient and contemporary, we'll discover how boundaries can become not barriers to connection, but gateways to authentic presence. The Buddha taught that understanding suffering is the first step toward freedom. To understand Michael's suffering, and perhaps our own, we must look beneath the surface of his constant giving to the wounds that drove it. Michael's pattern of boundaryless helping wasn't born from spiritual maturity. It emerged from childhood wounds that taught him a painful lesson. His worth depended on his usefulness. As the oldest child in a household with an alcoholic parent, he learned early that his role was to maintain peace, to anticipate needs, to be the emotional support that adults couldn't provide. I remember being 7 years old, Michael later told his teacher, and learning to read my father's face the moment he walked through the door. I could tell from the slightest twitch of his eyebrow whether it was a good day or a bad day. On bad days, I became the perfect child, helpful, quiet, invisible when needed, present when called. This hypervigilance, this constant scanning of others' needs while suppressing his own, didn't end with childhood. It became the foundation of his identity, polished and perfected into what appeared to be spiritual virtue. In Buddhist psychology, this pattern has a name: hungry ghost compassion. Like the hungry ghosts of Buddhist cosmology, beings with tiny mouths and vast, empty stomachs. This form of giving comes not from fullness, but from lack. It seeks to fill an inner emptiness through external validation. The 8th century Buddhist master Shantideva warned of this when he wrote, "All those who suffer in the world do so because of their desire for their own happiness. All those happy in the world are so because of their desire for the happiness of others." But this teaching is often misunderstood. It doesn't call for self-erasure. It calls for a transformation of motivation. Michael's boundaryless giving wasn't truly about others' happiness. At its root was a desperate hope. If I give enough, I will finally be worthy. If I am indispensable, I cannot be abandoned. This is the wound behind the smile, not just for Michael, but for many who find themselves unable to set healthy boundaries. In Buddhist practice, we speak of the 4 Brahmaviharas or divine abodes: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Notice that equanimity, the balanced mind that knows when to engage and when to step back, is essential to this system. Without it, even virtues become traps. Michael had fallen into what we might call the kindness trap, a state where generosity becomes compulsive, where giving depletes rather than fulfills, where kindness becomes a strategy for survival rather than an expression of freedom. The signs of this trap were evident in his life. First, his giving left him exhausted rather than energized. True generosity, as the Buddha taught, brings joy to the giver. When giving consistently depletes us, it's a signal that something is out of balance. Second, Michael's kindness had become indiscriminate. He gave equally to those who respected his gifts and those who took advantage of them. In the Sigalovada Sutta, the Buddha advised discernment in relationships, recognizing that not all connections nurture our well-being. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, Michael had become resentful. Though he would never admit it, even to himself, a quiet bitterness had begun to color his thoughts. Why don't they see how much I give? Why don't they ask how I'm doing? Why am I always the one who has to show up? This resentment revealed the transactional nature of his giving, the unspoken expectation that his sacrifice would be recognized and reciprocated. True generosity, as taught in Buddhism, comes with no strings attached. Finally, Michael had lost connection with his own needs and boundaries. He could no longer distinguish between compassionate action and self-abandonment. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh often emphasized, caring for yourself isn't selfish, it's essential. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of others. The kindness trap closes when we mistake self-negation for selflessness, when we confuse people-pleasing with compassion, when we believe that having no boundaries is the same as having no ego. It's a misunderstanding of Buddhist teachings that leads not to liberation, but to depletion. The turning point in Michael's journey came through an unexpected encounter. A student mentioned a Buddhist teacher named Eleanor who lived in a small temple on the outskirts of Seattle. Unlike the spiritual teachers Michael had known, those who seemed to float above human limitations, Eleanor was known for her directness, her boundaries, and her insistence on self-respect as a spiritual practice. With some trepidation, Michael arranged to meet her. He expected a formal temple setting, but instead found himself in a modest garden behind a small house. Eleanor, a 72-year-old American woman who had studied in Japan and Nepal for over 4 decades, sat calmly on a stone bench. Her white hair was cut short, and her eyes held both warmth and penetrating clarity. Michael had prepared to present his spiritual resume, his years of yoga teaching, his meditation practice, his service to students. But before he could begin, Eleanor asked a simple question: "What brings you here today?" The directness of her question bypassed Michael's usual script. Instead of his planned speech, he found himself saying, "I think I'm disappearing." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Show me how you sit," she said. Michael assumed his meditation posture, back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands in a perfect mudra. "No," Eleanor said. "Show me how you really sit when you're alone and tired." Startled by her perception, Michael's posture changed. His shoulders hunched forward, his head lowered slightly, his hands fidgeted in his lap. "That's where we'll begin," Eleanor said. "With the truth of where you are, not the performance of where you think you should be." Over tea, Michael shared his struggle, the constant giving, the growing emptiness, the fear that setting boundaries would mean failing as a spiritual person. Eleanor listened fully. When he finished, she said, "The Buddha was once asked to heal a child. He refused, saying it wasn't his role. Jesus turned people away when he needed solitude. The Dalai Lama has a schedule and doesn't see everyone who asks. Were they unspiritual for having boundaries?" This simple observation cracked open Michael's understanding. Perhaps boundaries weren't opposed to spiritual life, but essential to it. In Buddhism, Eleanor explained during their second meeting, there's a concept called Upekkhā that's often mistranslated or overlooked entirely. It's usually rendered as equanimity, but that doesn't capture its full meaning. Upekkhā is the wisdom that knows when to engage and when to step back, when to act, and when to observe. She reached for a worn book on a nearby shelf, a translation of the Visuddhimagga, a 5th century Buddhist text. Here, the Buddha describes Upekkhā as the culmination of the Brahmaviharas, the divine abodes of loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy. Without Upekkhā, even these beautiful qualities become unbalanced. Michael leaned forward. This teaching directly challenged his understanding of spiritual practice as boundless giving. Think of it this way, Eleanor continued. Metta, loving kindness, is like the sun that shines on all beings equally. But the sun also maintains its distance. It doesn't abandon its own nature to warm others. It gives warmth precisely by being what it is and maintaining its position. She poured more tea for both of them, her movements deliberate and mindful. The Buddha didn't teach self-erasure. He taught the middle way between indulgence and denial. Many Western practitioners miss this and fall into what I call spiritual bypass, using spiritual concepts to avoid the necessary work of setting healthy boundaries. Michael thought about his own practice, how he had used Buddhist concepts of non-self and compassion to justify his inability to say no, to validate his fear of disapproval. In the Mangala Sutta, Eleanor continued, the Buddha lists Adisamapanati, proper understanding of self, as one of the highest blessings. This doesn't mean ego inflation, but it certainly doesn't mean self-negation either. She closed the book and looked directly at Michael. The Buddhist path isn't about becoming a doormat. It's about becoming fully human, with all the wisdom that entails, including the wisdom of boundaries. For Michael, this teaching was revolutionary. The concept of Upekkhā offered a missing piece in his spiritual understanding, permission to honor his limits not as spiritual failings, but as expressions of wisdom. Your boundaries, Eleanor said softly, are not obstacles to your practice. They are your practice. While Buddhist wisdom has recognized the importance of boundaries for millennia, modern neuroscience now confirms this ancient understanding. The integration of these perspectives offers a powerful framework for mindful seekers. The brain, Eleanor explained during their third meeting, has specific mechanisms for distinguishing between self and other. When these mechanisms function properly, we can feel genuine compassion without becoming overwhelmed by others' suffering. She introduced Michael to research on a neural network called the temporoparietal junction, TPJ, which helps us maintain a healthy sense of self while connecting with others. Studies show that experienced meditators have well-developed TPJs, allowing them to be deeply compassionate while maintaining healthy boundaries. This is why the most compassionate Buddhist masters aren't emotional wrecks, Eleanor noted. They've trained their brains to care deeply without merging identities with those they serve. Michael thought about how often he felt emotionally hijacked by his students' struggles, how their anxiety became his anxiety, Their problems became his responsibility. There's also fascinating research on something called empathic distress versus compassionate empathy, Eleanor continued. Empathic distress occurs when we take on others' suffering as our own. It leads to burnout and actually reduces our capacity to help. Compassionate empathy, by contrast, allows us to care deeply while maintaining perspective. She showed Michael a study from the Max Planck Institute, where researchers found that different types of meditation activate different neural networks. Practices focused on merging with others activated areas associated with empathic distress, while practices that balanced connection with equanimity activated areas associated with resilience and positive emotion. The Buddha was essentially a scientist of the mind, Eleanor said. He discovered through direct observation what neuroscientists are now confirming through brain scans. Boundaries aren't selfish, they're necessary for sustainable compassion. For Michael, this scientific validation was powerful. It helped him see that his boundary issues weren't just personal psychological challenges, but neurobiological patterns that could be rewired through practice. Your brain has been trained to equate boundarylessness with goodness, Eleanor explained. Through meditation and mindful boundary setting, you can create new neural pathways that associate healthy boundaries with compassion. I want to tell you about another student of mine, Eleanor said during their fourth meeting. Her story might resonate with yours. She told Michael about Sarah, a 45-year-old psychotherapist from Boston who had come to her 5 years earlier. Like Michael, Sarah had built her identity around helping others. As a therapist specializing in trauma, she went above and beyond for her clients, extending sessions without charging, answering calls at all hours, taking on pro bono cases despite an already full schedule. Sarah came to me with what therapists call compassion fatigue, Eleanor explained. She was experiencing nightmares about her clients' traumas, had developed physical symptoms from stress, and found herself increasingly resentful of the very people she wanted to help. Through their work together, Sarah discovered that her boundaryless helping wasn't serving her clients. It was creating dependency and preventing them from developing their own resources. More profoundly, she realized that her inability to set boundaries wasn't coming from compassion, but from a deep-seated fear that she wasn't enough without her helping role. The turning point for Sarah, Eleanor continued, came when she began practicing what we call compassionate boundaries. She started by making small changes, ending sessions on time, establishing clear policies about between-session contact, taking full days off without checking messages. These changes weren't easy. Some clients reacted with anger or hurt. Colleagues suggested she wasn't dedicated enough. But gradually, something shifted. Her clients began developing greater resilience. Her clinical outcomes actually improved. And most importantly, she rediscovered her love for her work. Sarah told me something profound last year. Eleanor said, I realized that by having no boundaries, I was treating my clients as if they were too fragile to handle my limits. That wasn't respect. It was condescension disguised as care. Michael sat with this insight, recognizing how it applied to his own teaching. Had his boundaryless availability actually been undermining his students' growth? Had his fear of disappointing others been masquerading as spiritual service? Sarah now sees her boundaries as an essential part of the healing she offers, Eleanor concluded. Not as barriers to connection, but as modeling for her clients what healthy self-respect looks like. In Buddhist practice, Eleanor explained, true compassion has edges. It's not soft in the sense of being weak or pliable. It's soft in the way that water is soft, yielding yet powerful enough to carve canyons through stone. She introduced Michael to the concept of fierce compassion, a term used in Tibetan Buddhism to describe compassionate action that doesn't shy away from setting limits or speaking difficult truths. Think of how the Buddha himself acted, she said. When his cousin Devdatta tried to create a schism in the Sangha, the Buddha didn't accommodate him out of kindness. He took a clear, firm stand. His compassion had edges. It wasn't about making everyone happy in the moment, but about upholding what was true and beneficial in the long term. Michael thought about his own teaching, how he often sacrificed his well-being and integrity to avoid any momentary discomfort in his relationships with students. Compassion without boundaries isn't really compassion, Eleanor continued. It's often fear wearing a spiritual disguise, fear of conflict, fear of disapproval, fear of not being needed. True compassion requires the courage to disappoint others sometimes, to say no when necessary, to allow others to face the natural consequences of their actions. She shared a teaching from the Tibetan tradition. The most compassionate response isn't always the one that feels good in the moment. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to allow someone to experience the discomfort that leads to growth. This perspective challenged Michael's understanding of spiritual service. He had equated being spiritual with being perpetually accommodating, with never causing even momentary disappointment. When you set a boundary, Eleanor said, you're not just doing it for yourself. You're creating clarity in the relationship. You're offering the other person the gift of your truth rather than the performance of people-pleasing. That's respect, not rejection. She looked at Michael with gentle directness. The question isn't whether you'll disappoint others. You will, because you're human. The question is whether you'll disappoint them by being authentic or by slowly burning out and becoming a hollow version of yourself. As Michael began the practice of setting boundaries, Eleanor offered him a framework for self-assessment. 5 signs that indicate when boundaries need strengthening. This framework, drawn from both Buddhist psychology and modern therapeutic approaches, provided practical guidance for his journey. First, Eleanor explained, notice when resentment arises. In Buddhist terms, resentment is a form of aversion that signals misalignment between our actions and our truth. When you feel resentment after helping someone, it's often because you've crossed your own boundaries. Michael recognized this immediately, the subtle bitterness he felt when students texted him late at night, the internal sigh when someone asked for just 5 minutes after class. Second, pay attention to physical depletion that exceeds the actual energy expended. Some tiredness after teaching is natural, but if you feel utterly drained by interactions that shouldn't be exhausting, your boundaries may be too permeable. You're likely absorbing others' emotional states rather than maintaining your center. Third, notice when you're rehearsing conversations excessively or ruminating about others' opinions of you. This mental proliferation, what Buddhism calls Upekkhā, often indicates boundary issues. When we're secure in our boundaries, we don't need constant reassurance that others approve of our choices. Michael thought about how much mental energy he spent imagining how students might react if he didn't respond immediately to their messages. Fourth, be aware of identity loss. Moments when you don't know what you want, need, or feel because you're so attuned to others. In Buddhist terms, this is a form of delusion, mistaking others' needs for your own. Finally, notice when your spiritual practice becomes performance rather than authentic expression. When meditation feels like one more thing you should do rather than a return to your true nature, it may indicate that your boundaries between self and role have collapsed. This framework gave Michael practical touchpoints for his daily life, specific indicators that could guide his boundary practice without relying solely on intellectual understanding. These 5 signs, Eleanor concluded, aren't judgments but invitations. Opportunities to realign with your authentic path and restore the boundaries that protect your spiritual well-being. To help Michael integrate these teachings into his daily life, Eleanor taught him a meditation practice that balanced loving-kindness, metta, with equanimity, Upekkhā. This practice, adapted from traditional Buddhist techniques, specifically addressed the challenges of maintaining healthy boundaries while cultivating genuine compassion. Find a comfortable seated position, Eleanor guided during their 5th meeting. Allow your body to be supported, your spine to be dignified. Take 3 deep breaths, feeling the natural boundary of your skin, this physical container that defines where you end and the world begins. Michael followed her instructions, noticing how rarely he actually felt the boundary of his own body during his usual meditation practice. Now, place one hand on your heart, Eleanor continued. This is the center of metta, loving kindness. With each breath, feel warmth and care radiating from this center. After several breaths, she added, place your other hand a few inches away from your body, palm facing outward. This hand represents Upekkhā, the wisdom that honors boundaries. It's not pushing away, but it's clearly defining your space. Michael found this physical representation powerful, one hand connecting with his heart's compassion, the other establishing a clear, energetic boundary. As you breathe, Eleanor guided, silently repeat these phrases. May I care deeply without losing myself. May I give from fullness, not from fear. May I honor the sacred boundary of my being. After several minutes with these phrases, Eleanor guided him to extend the practice outward. Now, imagine someone you tend to overgive to. See them clearly. Extend metta toward them with your heart hand. May you be well. May you find your own strength. And with your boundary hand, add, may I support you without merging with you. May I honor the boundary between us. This meditation provided Michael with a daily practice that reinforced the integration of compassion and boundaries. It wasn't about choosing between caring for others and caring for himself, but about finding the wisdom to do both simultaneously. Practice this daily, Eleanor suggested, especially before teaching or in situations where you tend to lose your boundaries. It's a way of reminding your nervous system that boundaries and compassion can coexist, that they strengthen rather than diminish each other. Over the months that followed, Michael's practice of boundaries transformed not just his teaching, but his entire approach to spiritual life. The changes weren't always easy. Some students were uncomfortable with his new limits. Some colleagues questioned his commitment. But as Eleanor had predicted, those who valued him for his authentic presence rather than his constant availability adjusted and remained. More profoundly, Michael discovered that his teaching deepened. With renewed energy and clearer boundaries, he could be fully present during the time he did offer. His practice of Upekkhā allowed him to care deeply for his students without taking on their struggles as his own. The light returned to his eyes, not the performative brightness of perpetual accommodation, but the genuine luminosity of someone living in alignment with their truth. The sacred art of boundaries, Eleanor told him during their final formal meeting, isn't about limitation but liberation. It's not about closing your heart, but protecting the flame within it so that it can warm others without burning you to ash. Welcome to the Noble Wisdom Path, where we uncover the sacred truths of your journey through Buddhist wisdom. The path of boundaries is a lifelong practice, one that requires both compassion and courage. As you continue your journey, I invite you to notice where in your life you might be giving from emptiness rather than fullness, where fear of disapproval might be masquerading as spiritual service. Join the Noble Wisdom Path community. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share your reflections below. How has the balance between compassion and boundaries shaped your spiritual journey? Until next time,